My name's Jim Hughes. I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety date is June the 19th, 1982. And I'm a member in good standing of the Gratitude Study Group. Meet on Monday night for a speaker meeting and Thursday night for a literature study meeting. I've got a sponsor. I call him the Frog Man. It's Jim T. up in Durham. He has the best acronym I know in Alcoholics Anonymous, FROG. Fully rely on God, and he lives that way. He has a frog on his door, and before he goes out into the world, he remembers who he is and where he came from. And I like him. He's been sober since 1972. So here's what happened to me. I got drunk for the first time in 1962. I was 14 years old, and a friend of mine's sister got married, and the reception was at the country club, and they had champagne bars in every corner of the room, and I figured out a way that I could just make a constant circle, and so I got very drunk that night, and I don't know, I kind of liked it, and I finished high school. I didn't. Here's what happened too. My older brother was very smart, and he's on the faculty at the Yale Medical School. And so they told me this story. He hung around the Pure Oil station at the corner of Old Hope Valley Road and University Drive. And some of those guys were drinking, and he was in high school, and so they took the SAT, and they told me this story, and they said, he got drunk the night before he took the SAT, and he spent the last 45 minutes throwing up in the bathroom. I thought that was the coolest thing I'd ever heard. He made like $1,450 on his SAT, and he was a National Merit Scholar and all that. So when it came time for me to take the SAT, I tried that, Steve, because I wanted to be as cool as he was, and I didn't make no 1,400, and so somehow or another, I got into Chapel Hill, and my brother was already there, and he joined this fraternity, and it was a drinking fraternity, and I started drinking seriously when I was 18 years old, and I drank seriously for the next 14 years. I got sober in 1982 in June, and so I had a indistinguished career at Chapel Hill. I flunked out in 67, 69. I almost graduated in 70. I almost graduated in 72, and I finally graduated in 76. I made my parents proud. I graduated with a 2.000, and I'd reached that point where I could not take any. I had to make a B in the last course, and if I didn't make a B, it was mathematically impossible for me to graduate. And so I begged the instructor, the professor, to give me a B, and he did, and I graduated. And that's the only way I got out of there. But in the meantime, I grew up, always wanted to be a newspaper man. That was what I wanted to do, and I majored in journalism there, but didn't quite get a degree in that. But anyway, I met this professor who got me a job in 1970 as assistant sports editor of the Wilson Daily Times in Wilson, North Carolina. And shortly after I got down there, the sports editor got another job, and I was promoted to it's the best job I ever had. I think I was making $2.50 an hour. Man, I worked like 60. Anyway, I covered a lot of high school sports, and every once in a while they'd let me go up to Chapel Hill to cover some of the basketball games. So it was like the greatest job in the world. I gave my notice in the summer of '71. My brother was getting ready to go across the country to interview for his residency or his internship, one or the other. And so the plan was for me to meet him in Chicago, and then we'd drive across to the West Coast where he had some interviews. And so I gave my notice at the Wilson Daily Times, and 2 weeks before it was due, my assistant told me he couldn't do something, and I told him he had to do it, and I threw my typewriter, remember those, threw my typewriter against the wall, and they asked me to leave that day. And so that was like the first of my newspaper career, which was considerably undistinguished. And I got fired 4 out of the 6, and I'll tell you about a couple of them. So I ended up going across the country with my brother, and we stopped in Sausalito, and all of that stuff was going on in 1971. And so he went south, and I hitchhiked north up 101. And my plan was I was going to go work on the pipeline in Alaska, but I ended up getting as far as Juneau, and I went by and interviewed at the paper, and the guy offered me a job, but it was like -5 degrees, and I just thought that was not going to work. So I got back down, took the ferry through that little opening there, that little sound, and got back to Vancouver and took a bus across Canada. Out of money, I end up in Montreal with no money. I call my dad. My father was a physician in Durham. He's still alive. He's 98 years old. So he wired me enough money. He bought my airline ticket on Old Eastern Airlines, and I flew home from Montreal. And I got into the airport, and my father looked at me in just total disgust and said, "You look like Charles Manson." I just continued to make my father and mother proud all through the 1970s. I got a job at the Kingsport Times News. I was the outdoor editor, which is a little incongruous because really the only thing I knew about the outdoors was occasionally I passed out in it. I ended up getting beat up outside of the sorriest tapas bar in America, right across the Virginia line. And this guy pushed me out in the parking lot. Susie said it was okay, I could tell the story if I cleaned it up. And so he says, he's trying to get me to fight, and I was a little resistant to that. And so he says, "I slept with your mother last night." You remember all that? You remember that? And I said, "I know, she told me." She said it was the worst she'd ever had. That's when he started mopping the floor. Thank you for letting me tell that, Susan. I was worried about that. He just mopped the parking lot with me. I had a talent for getting beat up. I had gotten, that was my one. I haven't won a fight since the 6th grade. In the 7th grade, I got beat up by the guy who was a bedwetter. That was my story. Just not much of a fighter, but I somehow always ended up getting in a fight. So anyway, what happened was I ended up leaving Kingsport after that night, and I came back, and I didn't know what I was going to do. What do you do when you washed out of everything? Well, I ended up on my parents' couch again, and this was 1973 or 4, somewhere in there. And I didn't know what I was going to do, but miraculously, this guy who had been the night editor in Kingsport called me up and offered me a job for the Burlington Times News in Burlington, North Carolina. And so I got fired from that job for improper urination. I went to the bathroom in the women's room, and I thought there was nobody there. It was kind of late at night, like 8 o'clock at night, everybody gone home, not late at night. But, and the publisher's secretary also happened to be working late and was in the stall next to me. And so the next day they asked me to leave. So anyway, from there, I think that was 1975. 74, because I went up to Washington. Some friends of mine, I know some of you all remember the Watergate Committee. Sam Irvin from North Carolina was the chairman of the Watergate Committee, and a bunch of people from Chapel Hill who I knew went up there to get jobs on Capitol Hill, and it was a small army of, starch khakis and blue blazers and striped ties and tassel loafers. And so I went up there. I didn't get a job on the Hill, but I did get a job working on the D.C. Metro, and as a carpenter's apprentice. And I really did that work. I did that work for a while. I was like the worst carpenter ever, but they kept me around, I think, just for comic value, you know. But it was nasty work, and somewhere in there, I went up. A friend of mine was finishing up hiking the Appalachian Trail, and so we all met up at Katahdin and did the last 10 or 12 miles with him, and he stayed up there, and I ended up going up there occasionally to get away and, you know, as an escape. So that takes me up to 1976, and so I come back, and a bunch of the people from my crew were going down to work on a bridge across the Mississippi River, and they invited me to go with them, and so I hitchhiked down there from North Carolina down to New Orleans, and it was an impressive project, and we worked on a barge in the middle of the river. I couldn't get my carpenter card cleared in because you had to, but so I got the labor job. So we worked on this barge in the middle of the river, and the thunderheads would roll down the river, and lightning would strike, and everybody would panic. And I did that work for. It's just hot. You're in the middle of the river, and there's no relief. And we were hauling these damn willow trees to try and make a willow mat. And I'd get on the short end of it, and this guy from the mountains was on the butt end of it, and we'd roll those things in and sink them, and it was amazing, the whole thing. I drove over it about 20 years ago, and still standing. Amazing. The D.C. Metro, I understand, is having some shakiness, but I don't think they can blame me for that. Anyway, a friend of mine comes down from Chapel Hill, and he was going to go to Tulane and study Southern history. And instead, we decided we would drink. And so we started drinking in New Orleans, and basically I didn't go to work again. And one night in the French Quarter, I was dressed exactly like I am now, starched khakis, blue blazer, you know, the whole look, tassel overs. And a cop pulled me over. I was walking down probably Bourbon, but the one parallel to it. And he stopped me, and he reached into my pocket and took my last $11. I'd been drinking all day, and 50-cent Dixie beers and $1 shots. And I'd been drinking all day, and I started with $50. I had $11 left. He took my $11 out of my pocket. I swear this is true. I'm not making this up. And he took it, and he pushed me and said, "Go on. Do you know who you're dealing with?" And that was, so I ended up getting arrested for intimidating an arresting officer, a felony in Louisiana, 5 years at Angola cutting sugar cane, and public drunk, and my favorite, profanity. So, so anyway, they take me to the House of D, and then they transfer me over to parish prison. I'm the only one dressed like this, just like tonight. And you know, I'm walking in they got the manacles on, and I'm walking in the court the next day. And this friend of mine got me out on my own recognizance, but I had to hire an attorney because it wasn't fair. It cost everything I'd saved up. And on my 27th birthday, September 27th, 1975, that's why I remember it, the judge says, "I'll drop all charges if you promise that you'll accept public drunk, if you'll leave town today." And I said, "Your Honor, I'll be on that Greyhound this afternoon." And I was, and I went back, and what do you do? End up at my parents' couch again. And so once again, that friend of mine ends up opening a bar in Buckhead, and he tells me to come on down, and they give me a job as a bouncer, which is, thank you very much, I'm not that big, not that strong, haven't won a fight since the 6th grade. So I get in another altercation in the parking lot. They wanted me to clean it up, police the area, make sure they weren't drinking beer that they brought in. And they pointed out the guy. He seemed like a pretty big guy. And so I said, you're going to have to go inside to buy the beer. You can't drink your own beer out here. And I don't know. I always heard that if you swung first and got the first punch and you had a chance. When I swung and I missed him about that far, but I was pretty drunk. We've been drinking now for about 5 years, and I saw the first punch coming, and ended up on. He said they told me that he hit me several more times on the way down, but I didn't know it, and. But I got up and I said, listen, I'm going to go home and change my underwear, and when I come back, I'm going to kick your ass. So that was another one. And what's happened is I started losing vision in the right eye about 18 months ago. And so I went to Duke, and they said, well, your optic nerve is dead. And I said, did you ever have any physical trauma, blunt trauma to your eye? And that's when I remembered all the times I got punched out on the right side. So it's a long tail. My drinking career is a long tail. Anyway, at some point in there, I went to graduate school at East Carolina to get a master's in English. This was not a good career move. If you've been to Greenville, so I didn't quite make it through there. And in 1978, I got a job, and I don't even know how this happened. I got a job as the lead reporter for the Chapel Hill newspaper covering the University of North Carolina. And that was a great job. And I don't know why. I got an offer to go work for this little paper in Research Triangle Park, and they increased my salary by about 50%. I went to Orville Campbell, who owned the Chapel Hill newspaper. And incidentally, Orville is the one who produced Andy Griffith's What It Was football, and started Andy's career. So Orville was a great guy, and he took care of a lot of alcoholics, and I was one of them. And I told him how much they were offering me. I didn't want to take the job. He said, well, you'll never make that kind of money here. And so I took the job, and I lasted I think 4 months out there, and they finally came to me and said, you're going to have to go. And so now that's 1979. In 1980, I wrote a couple of stories for this little publication in Raleigh on voodoo, and I went down to Voodoo Village in Beaufort, South Carolina. And for the longest time, I thought that the guy had put the root on me because I had the worst luck all that time. The real reason I had bad luck was because I was drunk all the time, but I thought it was the root. So I came back and wrote those stories, and I wrote this story about how, and most of y'all aren't going to remember it, but how John East beat Robert Morgan in the 1980 Senate race. Maybe it was a 78 Senate race. No, it was 80. And I wrote this story, and it got some play, and for about 10 minutes I had a future in journalism. And so I got this idea that I would write a story about this congressman from North Carolina who, I promise we're almost there, because here's what happened. I was going to write this story on this North Carolina congressman who had multiple wives. He got multiple speeding tickets. He was the greatest guy I ever knew. We held the interview at the Four Corners restaurant in Chapel Hill, and he'd been drinking for a while. I'd been drinking for 5 days, at least this time. And halfway through the interview, he says, I've got an opening on my staff for a press secretary, and I couldn't pay you but $35,000. Would you be interested? Well, I hadn't made $35,000 since the last time I flunked out of Carolina. So I said, well, don't you want to read the story first? And he said, no, you'll do fine. So that story turned 180 degrees. All of a sudden, he was the best congressman we ever had in North Carolina history. And so I go up there in January of 1982 to be his press secretary. Now, I don't know if y'all remember that was the year that Carolina won Dean's first national championship when Michael Jordan made that shot. And we all got drunk on and incidentally, Dean's sister worked for this congressman. And so she was down in New Orleans for the game. But we all went out and went all over the Capitol Hill drinking everywhere. And I went back, I lost my three-piece suit. I lost the vest and the coat. I don't know where. You know, it's like that poem, I've been to Ludlow Fair and left my necktie God knows where. You know, that's kind of the deal there. I lost my coat. The next day I went to go try to retrace my steps, and I walked down 209 and a half, was downstairs on Pennsylvania Avenue up on the hill. And I go down there, and the guy's down there, and he says, I told you to get the hell out and never come back. So I don't know if he had my coat, but anyway, things got worse, and I came back on June 19th. In March of that year, I came back to the district office, and there was a woman working there named Vicki P. And this is really key. And Vicki came up to me one day in March and said, "I've been noticing that you come into the office shaky and sweaty, and I just wanted you to know that if you ever want to do anything about your drinking, give me a call." And I told her that I had a pretty good grasp of my alcoholic strengths and weaknesses, and thank you very much, and went on about my business. And so on June the 19th, I was at a wedding of a friend of mine, and I'd been drinking for several days, and it was a 12 o'clock wedding. I can't remember, but anyway, it was an afternoon wedding, and it was a champagne reception, and we're sitting at the bar in the Marriott right there on Glenwood Avenue, and I started with circular tables, and I start noticing that everybody was, leaving, kind of like everybody is tonight. So I'm just kidding. So they said, "Why don't you come get something to eat with us?" And I said, "No, thank you." So the next thing I remember is like 6 red coats picking me up and escorting me out. Now, usually in that situation, I would pass out in the back seat of my car, but my car was loaded up. So my plan. Plus, they told me that I had to leave the premises. So I decided that what I'd do is I'd make it halfway back and pass out in the Borough's Welcome parking lot at the Research Triangle Park. So this was a good plan up until the minute that I'm doing about 50 down Glenwood, and I noticed that the light is changing. And I also noticed that there's a state trooper over here in the left-hand turn lane. Now, my options, I'm thinking this through as I'm accelerating in my, come on now. And so I end up in the middle of the intersection, and the traffic light is right here, and I can look up, and then, so of course, the blue light comes on, and I get to sit in the front seat of the trooper's car, and he takes my car and parks it. He's not supposed to do that, but he got it out of the street, and I told him, "Look," he says, "How long have you been drinking?" I said, "Officer, I've been drinking for at least 5 days, and but listen, I'm trying to make something of my life. I got a good job for the first time in my life, and really, if you can just see your way clear to giving me a break." And I think he tried to, but we talked for a while. It turns out that his nephews were playing football for Carolina, and so we talked about Carolina football and North Carolina politics, and what the hell was I doing with my car in the middle of the road. But he tried to give me every break, but he took me downtown. He gave me one phone call. The judge I knew at that time was not in town, so that I spent the night in jail. And here's what I'm thinking the whole time: how am I going to get out of this one? Because I wanted to keep that job, and I knew that, if it ended up in the paper, this was going to be a really difficult election in 1982. And so I didn't want to embarrass my boss. And also I wanted to keep my job if they, So I remembered that what Vicki had said. Dave Cook says all the time that a coincidence is just an act of God in the midst of time. And you think about all these things that happened to me. I mean, how the hell does a guy like me get a job as a press secretary in Washington, D.C.? And look, that's like the greatest job in the world for an alcoholic, because they have a reception like every night. It's your tax dollars at work. I don't know how they do anything up there, but especially with people like me working there. But so anyway, I remembered what Vicki had said, and so when I called her up, and she called a guy named Hoke Johnson. I don't know if any of y'all remember Hoke, but Hoke called my first sponsor, a guy named Dick Still, who was chief counsel for the House Banking Committee, and he took me to my first meeting. Now, all I intended to do was to just stay sober till election day, get my case continued, and this required that maybe I had to do what they told me to do in Alcoholics Anonymous. I was going to, Jim's a good boy. He's trying to get his life back. He's a good boy. And maybe somebody would testify at my trial. That's actually what I thought. And so this guy named Ed Chandler, part of the famous class of '64 with Sandy Beach and Hal Marley, used to pick me up every Tuesday morning and take me to this meeting on Capitol Hill called the Yays and Nays Group. And I thought it was pretty slick, because where they met at that time was in the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee, and there was a slick table, a coffee table, and a chandelier that came down, wainscoting, and everybody there was dressed in coats and ties, And I said, well, I can make some good contacts. This might be good for my career. But anyway, Ed would pick me up and he would talk to me about what had happened to him, and it was evident to me that he was the real deal, that he was a real alcoholic. And he told me that, he said, I'm going to tell you, you don't ever have to drink again. I'm going to tell you what my sponsor told me in 1964. And he said, make your arrangements in the morning, ask for the strength not to take a drink that day, say thank you at night, and ask again for the next day. Now, here's what when they first gave me that little wallet-sized card, y'all ever see those? I looked at it and said, this might work if you've got an IQ below 100, but this isn't going to work for a smart guy like me, because here's the problem. There is no God, and that's where I started. And so Ed Chandler's telling me to pray to something that I didn't believe in, for something that I didn't want to do, which was quit drinking. I don't know why I did it, but I did. And the most amazing thing happened. I stayed sober. And I came back down to the district, and after Ed did that for me, I called my attorney and said, just plead the case, whatever happens, happens. And, it turns out I wasn't that important anyway, which is the story of my life. And there were no headlines, there was nothing. But about 20 to 25 days later, 30 days later, I'm back in Durham, and I'm at a meeting at the Scout Hut, and there's a guy there named Everett Bugg. Now, I'm going to make this real quick, but this is a favorite part of my story, is that Everett Bugg used to come to Trolls Bar in Chapel Hill, and he owned the Baskin and Robbins franchise on Franklin Street. And he would open that store, and then he would make a beeline to Trolls at 10 o'clock in the morning. The only place I've ever been where the happy hour was at 10 o'clock in the morning. And I was at the Scout Hut, and so he drank there, and then one day we didn't see him anymore. But we didn't think too much about it because we didn't care. But, so here he was at this meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and he said, "Have you done?" And his father and my father were good friends, and so he says, "Have you done the third step prayer?" And I said, "I didn't even know what it was." So he got the big book, he showed it to me, took me into the church, and we did the third step prayer. Now, those two things I did diligently for the next 9 years. And things got good for me. My guy got beat in '85. I came back to Raleigh, started working in public relations. I got really lucky. And I'd always thought that my destiny was to marry a rich girl. I really did. I thought that was my destiny in life. And I had met this woman in D.C. who fit the bill. Her family owned a bunch of natural gas wells in Louisiana, and I met her, and she had trouble staying sober. Well, every once in a while, I'd come back up to Washington, come through Washington, and sometimes we'd go out, and sometimes we wouldn't. She didn't really want to have much to do with me. She had more important men in her life. But this time I came back in, and she had just gotten out of rehab for the fourth or fifth time, and she, I told her what Vicki had told me, and I said, if you ever want to do something about your drinking, give me a call. About 2 weeks later, she comes rolling into town, dead drunk, and she wrecked her Mercedes, her mother's Mercedes, and she was driving a slick Mustang convertible that she'd rented, and she called me from the little pool hall there that was next to Wake Med. And so I picked her up, and she was hammered. But for the next 2 months, she would call me, 2, 3, 4 times a week, and she would say, "You're coming up to Washington, and we're going to get married." And I went to Hoke, and Hoke said, "Well, my grandchildren will appreciate it." And one day she called me and she said, "You got to come up here. I bought a house. I got a membership in the country club. We'll have a great life." And I said, "I can't do it. I'm building my business. Things are going great." She said, "How much do you make?" And I multiplied by 2. And I told her, and she said, "I make that much off a month off the interest alone." And I said, "I'll see you Saturday." I did 9 years sober. Hadn't done much in the way of step work at that point. All right, I gotta wrap this up. So I knew that lasted about 8 days. It was just a disaster. And so I left in the middle of the night. She had all these candles on the front porch, this little country house she'd fixed up. And she was playing my favorite song, "He Stopped Loving Her Today." And, it's all kind of pathetic. But so I'm driving home, and I just knew that if I didn't change, I was going to drink again, and I just didn't want to drink again. Things had gotten good for me, and so I came back and I hooked up the first time with Jim T, and went through those steps, and I did more than just a perfunctory work, but I didn't clean all the way out. But I didn't, things started going great for me, and I started making money, and I had a great life. We hooked up with some guys who were building golf courses all over the Southeast, and I worked for them. My job was to get the golf writers to come down, make sure they had enough whiskey, that's what I did until 2005, and I'd saved up a bunch of money, and things were going great. And then in 2007, I made some investment decisions that I probably should have talked to my sponsor about. Anyway, I lost everything, really, almost everything. I had just a little bit left in a retirement account, and I was angry, and I had a resentment against God. I said, "You've been so good to me. What happened?" But I went to this meeting in Raleigh on Saturday Night Live, and they were reading the 11th step. And if you look on page 105, it says, "We will be seized with a rebellion so sickening that we will not pray." And I said, that's exactly what I have done. I had stopped praying and I was trying to run the show myself. And so I got back into it. I had two great sponsors at that point, Hugh G. and Fred Barber, who's just one of the all-time great guys in Alcoholics Anonymous in Raleigh. And, I didn't get my money back, but I've gotten so much more. I have a serenity these days, a peace of mind, and I have worked. About a year ago, went back. Actually, a little more than that. 2 years ago, I went back to Jim T. and after Fred's death, and we started going through the steps again. I'm telling you, if you're new and you're struggling and you don't believe it can work, I'm going to tell you what my first sponsor said after when I was coming up on my first year of sobriety. Up there in Washington, they have a nice tradition. They give you a cake, and you get two speakers to speak for you. Somebody from the groups that you've been around. And so Dick asked me, "Well, where are you going to celebrate your anniversary?" And I said, "Dick, to tell you the truth, I'm not going to call attention to myself. I'm going to keep a low profile." And he looked at me like I was, just an idiot. And he said, "It's not for you. It's to show that if Alcoholics Anonymous can work for a miserable little self-centered son of a bitch like you, it'll work for anybody." I believe that to this day. If you're new tonight, please stick around and if you do what these people tell you to do, you'll get what they tell you you'll get. And I sure do appreciate Steve asking me to speak tonight. Thank you.